I do want to put up this tweet right now as well from the president from the White House talking about meeting with the G7 today as leaders condemned Iran's unprecedented attack against Israel and reaffirmed the G7's commitment to Israel's security. We want to bring in someone that's been in some of those rooms there as we're talking about everything that's going on in the Middle East. We want to be joined right now on the ground by John Hanna, a senior fellow at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America and also the former national security advisor to the Vice President Dick Cheney. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And it was unprecedented. That's the word we're hearing over and over again. How important are the next few days and weeks in terms of what's going on in the Middle East?
Well, it's a fateful moment, Andy. I mean, Israel's got a very, very big decision. This, as you say, an unprecedented attack, not just the first time ever that Iran has directly gone after Israeli territory, but really, as far as my memory serves, perhaps the largest single missile, cruise missile, drone salvo ever fired at a fellow state member of the United Nations by any state in the history of warfare. So Israel's got to decide, is it going to allow that simply to pass? Or does it have to do what is essential to Israel's strategic culture, and that is to hit back, and to hit back in an overwhelmingly punishing way to make sure that Iran and its proxy network will never think about striking Israel like this again?
Yeah, that's a strategic conversation that is going to be made at the highest levels. Of course, we heard from Israel in their kind of war cabinet meeting as well today. Just in terms of that, the Iran attack from its own sovereign country, it's not just, as the UN ambassador to Israel talked about, one of these tentacles of the Houthis, the Hamas, Hezbollah as well. How does that change it in your eyes to see it actually come from Iran?
It's a very, very big deal, in part because it does unmask this proxy strategy that Iran has so deftly used over the past several years, where it seems obviously prepared to expend and sacrifice every last Arab Shia militiaman, every last Houthi, every last Hezbollah or Hamas fighter to serve the national interest of Iran, while Iran itself remains immune from retaliation and response. Today, or last night, Iran really, by feeling like it had to uphold its own honor and going after Israel directly from its own territory, has now opened up an entirely new strategic situation. It has changed in a fundamental way the rules of the game and opened the door, I think, to something it might regret, which is Israel's retaliation. Now Israel has an open invitation and justification for striking directly at Iran if that's what it chooses to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned that's an interesting point, just to changing the name of the game, the fundamentals as well. I want to take us back several days, because I do want to put up a tweet right now from President Biden here talking about this as he's in this meeting as well, meeting with Secretary of State, the Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, other advisors as well. In terms of what's going on in that meeting, what are the conversations like there amongst President Biden and some of his national security advisors?
Well, in the aftermath of this strike, I mean, the president has made clear for certainly since October 7th that the highest value, unfortunately, that the United States has said in a very public way is it doesn't want escalation, and specifically doesn't want escalation with Iran, which I think has been entirely provocative and therefore given Iran a free pass to escalate on its own side as much as possible, knowing that the United States is very unlikely to target and hold accountable Iran itself for its orchestration of everything virtually that's happened in that region since October the 7th. So my guess is that Situation Room yesterday was entirely focused on how do we avoid this spiraling into a larger war? How do we make sure the Iranian retaliation last night is the end of it, and Israel, as the president says, takes the win and doesn't hit back at Iran and risk a potentially wider conflagration? That's the last thing the president wants, particularly in an election year, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I did want to ask you about that because it seems like a tightrope to say that you have ironclad support for Israel, but that you also won't play a part in any retaliation in terms of what Israel does for Iran. How much of a tightrope is it? How closely are those two aligned, and how do they manage to handle walking down that line?
Well, it's obviously proving very difficult. There have been so many mixed messages from the president over recent weeks, growing tensions and criticisms of Israel over its Gaza campaign, most of which I think are entirely unfair, and yet at the same time suggesting that at least when it comes to defending Israel against an Iranian attack, the administration admirably said in the last few days, we're with you, and then put the military resources of the United States into the mix. And the obviously American military support and intelligence, air defense played an important role supporting Israel in neutralizing this attack. But all of this hand-wringing about the risks of escalation, I think, is very bad and leads only to miscalculation on the part of Iran and our other enemies in that region about how far they might be able to push and hope that they can actually rupture the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Yeah, that is a very kind of tense relationship. We've seen it kind of ebb and flow over the last few weeks as well. I did want to ask you about it because the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations said the mask is off. Now it's time for the gloves to come on. In terms of a retaliation from Israel against Iran, and the U.S. will not play a part in this, but how much communication will there be from Israel to the United States about what their plans are if and when they do plan to retaliate?
I think that'll be the discussion in the coming days, that Israel will do wherever it can, cooperate, coordinate, give notice to the United States, particularly so the U.S. can take appropriate measures to protect our forces that are very vulnerable in that region in serving in Iraq and places like Syria, giving them as much advance notice as possible without compromising, obviously, the security of Israel's operations there. I think there will also have to be some level of talk about what happens if, in fact, Iran does then trigger a much larger response to Israel that maybe includes a multi-front battle with Hezbollah in particular and 150,000 rockets aimed at Israel. Because Israel at some point in time will need the United States to help contain and manage any risk of a wider war, and just to make sure Israel would have all the munitions and capabilities and resupply that it would need to be able, even if it's doing it on its own, to fight and win that major war, multi-front war, as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and potentially needing the American support as well, but also the American strength. I want to ask you about sanctions as well, because that's what the UN ambassador to the Israel also mentioned as well. Do you think those will play a part for the United States, that they may not play a part in the retaliation, but they'll play a part in terms of hitting them in their pocketbook, hitting them in terms of sanctions as well?
Well, listen, Andy, I certainly think that if the administration wants to have any hope of having any influence over Israel's response here, one thing it could do is really mobilize the countries of the Middle East and Europe and people in the United Nations to really go after the Iranians, snap back sanctions at the United Nations that reimpose international sanctions on Iran's missile and drone and nuclear program, going after this massive increase in illicit Iranian oil sales that we've seen, particularly to China, not allowing these waivers of sanctions that are unfreezing potentially billions of dollars making available to Iran that it can then move money around and further support these deadly terrorist proxy armies of it. So I think if the United States was actually able to be serious about diplomacy and sanctions and really imposing diplomatic punishment and pain on Iran, Israel would see that, in fact, it's not alone, that Iran is being forced to pay a high price for its attacks on Saturday night. And that could, I think, help shape and impact the degree to which Israel feels it really needs to go after Iran all by itself.
That is interesting. Yeah, potential way to de-escalate the situation as well. All right, John, I do want to ask you just in terms a larger scale of this, because when you were their national security advisor, 2005, 2009, of course, you spent time previously to that as well. Iran, still a very complicated region, the Middle East as a whole. Can you kind of compare and contrast what you saw there as a national security advisor to what's going on now? How different, how similar are the situations?
Well, I mean, Iran, of course, was always a problem. It was much less of a problem 20 years ago. Its nuclear program was just really getting into full swing. It would have been much easier to stop then if we had paid sufficient attention. But of course, then it was all about the war on terror, about these groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That we were fighting, these insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now we're talking about a potential multi-front war against one of our best allies in the Middle East, facing an Iran that has proxies that encircle Israel in a ring of fire, and Iran that is about a few weeks away from amassing sufficient fissile material for several nuclear bombs. And Iran that is also in a growing and closer alliance with Russia, China, North Korea, in a true axis of danger and resistance against the United States and the kind of world order and stability that the United States advocates. It's a very, very tense and difficult and dangerous world that we're entering here.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fact nuclear, and I think when people bring that up, it certainly causes a little goosebumps and kind of concerns a lot of people. And maybe just how close is Iran to that, and how much is a conversation both about de-escalating it, but knowing those capabilities are not too far down in the future for Iran?
Yeah, it's a huge consideration. They are terribly close, Andy. If you had told me when I left the White House on January 20th, 2009, that Iran would be a couple of weeks away from the material for several bombs worth, maybe 9 months or a year away from weaponizing that into a warhead that they could put on a missile to threaten the entire Middle East and parts of Europe, I would have told you you're crazy. We'll never get to that point. America and Israel together would have taken action to prevent it. And yet, 14 or 15 years later, this is exactly where we are in this kind of awful, dangerous situation where one of the greatest terrorist sponsoring nation in the world that swears death to America and to wipe Israel off the map is now this close to having the world's most dangerous weapons and being able to implement this absolutely genocidal aspiration that it has.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, fundamentally, potentially changing the game as well. All right, John Hanna, thank you so much for your insight, your perspective. You are invaluable here to our audience on Live Now from Fox. I appreciate your time. Any parting words? Any other thoughts that you want to let our audience know about before I let you go?
No, other than we've got to pray for Israel, and we've got to hope that the United States Congress, together with the U.S. administration, can get their act together and put the full force and power of the United States behind our best and closest and most important ally in the Middle East, and one of our most important in the world that is really not just fighting for itself, but Israel is the tip of the spear, fighting a battle against all of our enemies and on behalf of Western civilization against barbarism in the Middle East.
That is a good way to put it. All right, a good way to end. John Hanna, thanks again for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Have a great day. We appreciate your time on Live Now.
Thanks for having me, Andy. Thank you very much. Good night.